turn of events. It really was. And Ted doesn't get into, like, you know, he was an executive when Van Halen was making all those albums and all that stuff. He doesn't get into all that, like Balance, and he doesn't talk about Van Halen 3 or any of that stuff. He doesn't talk about the reunion or Roth coming back or his thoughts on that or Wolfie or any of that stuff. He doesn't touch any of that. But yeah, he doesn't really get into a lot of the, I guess, conjecture, but he does get into a lot of the relationship stuff that surrounds the album that kind of impact Crazy from the Heat EP had, like all these different things. Anyway, so what would you say in conclusion on this, Dave?
Get the book. It's worth reading.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. We are going to have an exclusive interview with the author, Greg Renoff, who worked with Ted Templeman on the book. And the book, like I said, is Ted Templeman, a Platinum Producer's Life in Music. And it is out this month. Definitely go pick it up. If you're a Van Halen fan, it's required reading for sure. Anybody listening to this podcast, I mean, it's definitely right up your alley. So check that out. Greg Renoff coming up next. Take a listen.
All bands are very fragile units, you know, and everybody, I always said we have 4 very different personalities. I never misconstrued the situation, you know, and it just came to a parting of the ways. Not so much about the music, you know, it was about, you know, how we were going to go about making your life.
Hi, I'm Jackie Martling. My brand new autobiography, The Joke Man, Bow to Stern, is being released. Go to JackieTheJokeman.com. Great holiday gifts, easy to wrap. I guarantee you are going to love this book.
Hey, this is Jake Miller from Completely Unchained. You're listening to Dave and Dave Unchained. Rock on, man.
Check out the new podcast, The Rock Quarry, your place to hear in-depth interviews with some of rock's most colorful characters, with your host, entertainment journalist David J. Criblay. The Rock Quarry is available for free on Spreaker and iTunes. You can check us out on Facebook at The Rock Quarry Podcast, on Twitter at Rock Quarry Pod, on Instagram at The Rock Quarry Podcast, or email us at therockquarrypodcast@gmail.com.
No, Edward says that because he wants you to be pissed at me. He wants you to dislike me just as much as he does, you know. And he's going to come and he says, yeah, well, he wants to be a movie star. So you think of all you rock cats and kitties out there, you're going to turn around and go, yeah, Dave, he's turning into Sting. He thinks he's Dr. Frankenstein. Blah. You know, and come like that. Hey, man, you know, I'm going to make a movie, look, after 7.5 years of blistering neon plastic at 33 1/3, you know, and go like that. Can I make a movie? One? You know, I go, and we make a movie. And it'll take me, what, how many months? And we get a beautiful new record out of it, and we'll smear the music all over the movie, and then we're going to go on tour, and we're never going to come home.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have an incredible guest this evening. You know him. You love him. He is one of Van Halen fans' favorites. It is Van Halen Rising author and now new author of Ted Templeman, a Platinum Producer's Life in Music, Greg Renoff. Hey, Greg.
Hey, how are you guys?
Excellent, man. Excellent. Well, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
This has been a long time coming. You've been working on this for how long, Greg?
I started working on it pretty soon after Van Halen Rising came out. So Van Halen Rising came out in 2015. Hard to believe it's been that long.
Yeah.
It's been in process really since about early 2016.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just to start off, wanted to ask you, this is Ted Templeman's book. Ted Templeman, for those who don't know him, shame on you. He is the producer extraordinaire for Van Halen's first 6 albums and also co-producer of their 9th album. He is literally a large reason why we have Van Halen. And Greg really details that in the book. Greg, just to start off, how did the whole meeting of Ted Templeman come about?
So at the end of the research process of doing Van Halen Rising, I was able to track down Ted. Ted is a pretty low profile. He doesn't have a website or anything like that. And I was able to basically find somebody who had worked with him through the Doobie Brothers, basically. There's someone who in the Doobie Brothers camp, and I was able to reach out to Ted, and I said, I'm working on this book on Van Halen's beginnings, and I wanted to talk to him about signing Van Halen, and he emailed me back and said, sure, I'll talk to you. We had a conversation, about a 45-minute conversation. A few weeks before Van Halen Rising came out, I had done a podcast sometime earlier before that, before the Van Halen Rising was about to come out. I'd done it maybe 3 months earlier, and Ted had heard this podcast and said, "Hey, I really liked what you had to say. I can't wait to check out the book." In the process of that whole thing, along those weeks leading up to the release of the book, I asked Ted to join me at the bookstore out in Pasadena, Romans Books, and Ted agreed to do that, which was amazing, and came out, signed books, talked to people, answered questions, and sat with me there at the bookstore when the book first was released. And soon after that, I had talked to Ted by email and called to thank him a couple of times and those types of things. And I just pitched him the idea of doing a biography. And he was, at first, I think, a little bit hesitant to do it because he didn't want to really be someone who was going to write a book with a ghostwriter or write a book that was going to be seen as sort of, Ted Templeman, look how important I am. And when I talked to him about what I wanted to do with the book, I really wanted to try to pay tribute to the artists he'd worked with, from Doobie Brothers to Carly Simon to Little Feat to Bette Midler and, of course, Van Halen, and really talk about the making of the records, so how Ted approached making records and Ted's musical upbringing as well, and how he kind of came together as a person who was a musician himself, but also someone who became a very skilled producer, and kind of look at that process. And when we talked about it, Ted was game at that point and was willing to go ahead with the understanding that, it would be a book that would be focused on the music rather than sort of, look at how dramatic my life was, sort of like a lot of celebrity biographies. Ted didn't want to do one of those books.
What was the process that you guys had in writing the book? Obviously, Ted's not really a writer. You're a writer and a researcher. And so how did you guys kind of exchange?
So, at the beginning, Ted would send me emails. So the very beginning process was me, emailing him back and forth. I'm in Oklahoma and Ted was out on the West Coast, and we started that way. And then eventually I came out and visited with him. I stayed out there for a few days and visited with him and sat with him over the period of 3 or 4 days and did interviews with him, and hours of interviews, and kind of went through his career album by album, not necessarily in a very, exacting way. We didn't march through the catalog, but sort of, covering the Doobie Brothers material and then maybe jumping to Van Halen and then maybe jumping to Bullet Boys or Aerosmith. And we kind of worked our way through that. And then what I did was I typed up those interviews and began to sort of to flesh it out that way using the interviews and then the emails he did. And then I just tried to fill in the gaps along the way. So part of what I tried to do with the book as well is to make sure that it was really pretty carefully grounded in the historical chronology of how he did his records. So I would kind of go back and figure out when a certain album was released. If I found a newspaper article that was talking about Ted or a magazine interview, I'd send it to him and that might jog some memories for him. Go, oh, I totally forgot I had done this song. Or, sometimes there were things that he had actually had slipped his mind completely, and then we would talk about the things that I sort of brought to his attention. And so that was really how it went. And then went out there a couple more times over the course of working on the book with him. I went out there and stayed, in LA, and then would go and visit with him, and we'd sit and I'd do more interviews. And that was really the process. And then as we got towards the end, sending him drafts of chapters and him reading things and going, oh, that's not quite exactly what I meant, or you really got this right. This is on target. And we sort of dialed it in that way and got it done.
What didn't Ted want in the book? Was there anything that was off limits?
I think for Ted, it really wasn't meant to be any sort of tell-all about his life or anyone else's life. I mean, I think, as I said to you guys at the beginning, it was meant to be a focus on the music. I mean, I think he wanted to just be honest about how important his relationships were with the musicians he worked with and how much affection he feels for people, everyone from Michael McDonald to David Lee Roth. I mean, down the line, Steven Tyler. I mean, he really deeply cares about these individuals because he knows that they gave their heart and soul into making these records and worked with him so closely. I mean, I think one of the things I really got out of working on the book with Ted is how, intensely you work with people on these projects that, it's one of these things where for some bands, obviously it's a relationship with a producer that lasts many years. And for others, it's maybe only 6 months, but still in the course of over a 6-month period, for example, from the time Ted met the guys in Aerosmith, worked on demos with them, you're with these individuals every day and you have these great memories of this fun time you had with them. And, I think Ted really wanted to do right by all these people. And so, it wasn't meant to be sort of a book that was going to cast things in an unnecessarily negative light. I think Ted was honest about things that were difficult for making certain records and certain clashes he had with different people, but it wasn't meant to be something that was going to be, here, let me tell you every bad thing about every person I ever worked with, that type of thing,
Sure. So now, because you're known for writing Van Halen material because of Van Halen Rising, was there a decision to be made about how much Van Halen to put in the book and how much to leave out? I mean, obviously he spent a lot of time working with Van Halen, and I would imagine that Van Halen is probably his most success if you add up the numbers in sales, right? So, like, how did you decide to put how much Van Halen in the book and what to include and what not to?
Well, I mean, part of it was driven by, chronology of years. I mean, so Van Halen's work with Ted lasts from 77 through, 1984, and then on the stuff with Dave that carries up through 86. And then you have the year with Sammy. So, there were a lot of years there. And
Right.
in terms of trying to do the book, one of the things I had to make a decision about is that you can't, in writing a book like this, you can't cover every single album the guy made. It would be a 700-page book, and it would be just sort of monotonous and sort of,
Right.
He's jumping around to this and that. So, part of it was that process of thinking about what's going to work together in terms of trying to build a story that people can relate to and understand and follow.
Right.
So that you had a big chunk in there. I mean, there's a big chunk of the book obviously is Van Halen, a very big, but also of course the Doobie Brothers is just a super important band for Ted's legacy. And he worked with those guys over the course of a decade. There was never any talk between me and Ted of going, we don't want too much Van Halen or we want more Doobie Brothers. It was just a matter of how it sort of naturally played itself out in terms of the stories that we thought important to telling the story, and also, as I said, sort of the focus of the of the years dedicated to them. So there's obviously going to be a lot more material about the Doobie Brothers than is about Little Feat. Even though Ted made 2 albums with Little Feat, it was just they were not as, there just wasn't as much stuff there. In other words, in terms of what to talk about.
So now, in terms of Ted's role, he's sort of a unique individual because he's a producer and also a very high-level executive, which is a dual role, and it's also a very powerful role. So would you say he almost had like a George Martin type effect on Van Halen? Because Van Halen seemed like to be very, very personal for him because he was right there in the beginning and took them through all the way to the top of the mountain. So do you feel like Van Halen almost was a little bit of a special place in his heart because of the incredible journey? And these guys were like basically like kids when he started with them.
So there were 3 acts that Ted just, in effect, just quote unquote discovered,
right,
that he brought to big hits. That would be Doobie Brothers, Van Halen, and Nicolette Larson. I think the difference with Van Halen is, and why maybe Van Halen was a little bit different for Ted, is because Doobie Brothers, Ted started doing the first record he did with Lenny Waronker. So Ted didn't have that band as his quote unquote own for the first record. I think, again, this is kind of speaking for him, and I'm not 100% sure he would necessarily 100% agree with this, but, I think for Van Halen, for him to see them in the Starwood in the nightclub, be so knocked out by Eddie Van Halen, sign them, do the demos with them, and sort of, again, as you mentioned, bring them from out of total obscurity, from nowhere in Los Angeles, all the way to the actual pinnacle of superstardom.
Right.
I think that really is one of the reasons why. So with Nicolette Larson, there was a couple of albums Ted did with her, but she didn't have that sort of long sustained career. Ted is extremely proud and extremely grateful to the guys in the Doobie Brothers. So I don't think it's matter either or, but I think it's possible that that's part of what the difference was. That really this was Ted's baby from the beginning, meaning that he was the one who basically scouted those guys, signed those guys, and then produced the first record on their own. Of course, it was such a huge hit, and that's the big difference between the Doobie Brothers and Van Halen too, is that the Doobie Brothers, their first record, co-produced by Lenny and Ted, wasn't a hit. In fact, it was a flop. The second record that Ted did almost solely on his own, there was a couple tracks that was produced by another gentleman, but that was basically a Ted Templeman production. That one was a hit. So I think that's part of it too, was that sort of out of the gate, those guys had such a huge success too. I think the third thing I would say is that, Ted was just knocked out by the working relationship between Ed and David Lee Roth. Just constantly talking about how special it was, and that it was something that was unique, and once it had ended, it was something that was really not replaceable in his mind by any other combination of guys that you could put around either Dave or Ed or anyone else. It was just something magical about that working partnership and the way those guys wrote together and that type of stuff.
Greg, let's talk about that for a second, because in the beginning, Ted was not a David Lee Roth fan. He was very critical of his vocals, ready to replace him with Sammy Hagar. But by the time the band had broken up, he was no longer willing to produce the band because Dave wasn't in the band anymore. So,
well, I'm going to stop you there. Let me stop you there.
Okay.
I don't know if I would agree with that formulation. I think what I would say is that I'm not sure, based on my understanding of what happened, is that Ed wanted to work with Ted anymore, more than anything else. So say, the end of the 1984 tour, or the beginning of 1985, when there was trouble, Ted was sort of